Discontented Ghost, Chapter 5. The first member of the family to enter the library after breakfast the next morning was the minister himself. He walked in with his nose buried in the Times, already growling over what Americans call an editorial and we call a leader. He was so absorbed in his reading that he walked without looking to the place where he had taken tea the day before and slowly sat down, groping vaguely behind him with one hand for the arm of the chair. He groped in vain. His well-padded bottom hit the carpet with a thump, and his newspaper went flying, and his legs scissored in the air. What the blazes? He sat up and glared around the room. By heavens, she's already been in here moving the furniture. Lucretia! His angry bellow brought no immediate results. I will say one thing for Mrs. Otis. She never lost her dignity, nor her aplomb. In this case, as in most cases, she came at her own stately pace. Fuming, the minister scrambled to his feet and waited. When she appeared, he waved an accusing finger at her like a pistol barrel. Lucretia, you've been moving the furniture in here. She smiled as though pleased he had noticed. Yes, the children helped me. Isn't it infinitely better now? Better? I like to kill myself sitting down where a chair was supposed to be. Not again. Hiram, will you never learn to look around at a chair and make sure it's there before you sit in it? No, I'm an incurable optimist. Washington strolled in with a grin on his face. Any father would have found irritating. What, has Pa done it again? We don't need any smart aleck comments from you, Wash, snapped the minister, and he stooped to gather up his newspaper. As he did so, his gaze was arrested by an unexpected sight. He paused in mid-stoop for a stare, moved closer, and stared again. Instead of recoiling with the cry of horror one might have expected, he straightened up with a grimly satisfied expression on his face. He turned and shot a sarcastic look at his son. Pinkerton's Champion Stain Remover and Paragon Detergent, eh? And to think I let you talk me into buying a block of stock in that tin horn Myers and Podmore outfit. Wash. What a nickname. Wash flushed. What are you talking about, Pa? His father pointed to the floor. If you think that miracle worker of yours took care of that bloodstain, you've got another think coming. It's back. At last the stain called forth a look of horror from someone, but then it was succeeded on Wash's face by an expression of stubborn faith. I don't think it can be the fault of the Paragon detergent, he said. I've tried it with everything, and it never fails, so it must be the ghost. His sister Virginia, who had followed him into the room, looked down at the stain thoughtfully. Yes, she murmured, it must be the ghost. Perched invisibly in my customary place on the bookshelf under the stained-glass window in good Sir Alfred's portrait, I was heartened by the votes I was picking up. Little Miss Virginia now, it was rather dear of her to come through so unhesitatingly, throwing her support to me on the first ballot. At that point, the twins scampered in and took a look. Cool, said Ronnie. Ronnie, said Mrs. Otis. Wherever did you pick up that common expression? From Johnny. No, you didn't, said Johnny. I got it from you. And with that, they were rolling on the carpet in fierce fraternal battle. Oh, stop it, ordered Wash, picking up one in each large hand by the scruff of the neck and tossing them out of his path as he strode from the room. And don't let me hear any more of such expressions from you, ordered their mother. She stepped to a bell pull. I do not understand why Mrs. Umney has not attended to this. Her summons was answered by a young parlour-maid whose auburn-haired radiance seemed to set the room aglow as she entered. An absolute stunner she was. Mrs. Otis looked at her with benevolent surprise. Minister Otis's grumpy expression smoothed into one of robust pleasure. Miss Virginia took her in with the generous admiration that only a girl who was unconscious of her own beauty could have managed. Even the twins stopped kicking each other to take a look. Did you ring, ma'am? Yes, are you? I am Sheila, ma'am, said the girl, curtsying prettily. Bridget and I came early this morning. Bridget's the other new parlour maid, ma'am. Ah, yes, I heard a cart arrive quite early. Like Lady Canterville, Mrs. Otis found our birds troublesome in the morning, and was often awakened early. She smiled pleasantly at the new maid and added, You're very pretty, Sheila. Thank you, ma'am, said Sheila with another curtsy, and without losing her composure. Most parlour maids would have answered with a simpler or some silly remark. You speak quite well, too, said Mrs. Otis. Thank you, ma'am. I had the advantage of some education before my poor dear father lost his tailor shop and died of consumption, leaving us to make our own way as best we could. What a sad story. Well, I hope you will be happy with us, Sheila. Oh, thank you, ma'am. I'm sure I will be, said Sheila, smiling for the first time. I'm certain that anyone outside would have been startled to see the stained glass window suddenly light up. Good. Now then, Sheila, which of you tidied up the room this morning? I did, ma'am, said Sheila, and her brown eyes went with quick intelligence to the stain the Otises had been discussing. If it's that bloodstain you're wondering about, ma'am, Mrs. Umney told me I was not to touch it on any account, as it could not be removed. I see. Very well, you may go, said Mrs. Otis, and after another quick and graceful curtsy, Sheila went toward the door just as young Washington returned. He glanced at her, and then, as she slipped past him, with modestly downcast eyes, blinked as though he had momentarily lost control of his eyeballs. It took him a moment to recover himself and pretend he had not been knocked for a loop. Who was that? He asked with some overdone casualness. One of the new maids, dear, said his mother. Oh. Shaking his head as though to clear it, Wash produced that infernal black stick of his and advanced on the stain. Now we shall see, he said, throwing a challenging glance to his father. Stooping, he went to work on the stain for a second time, and for a second time he removed it, without leaving a trace, whilst I sat by glaring at him helplessly. His smugness as he straightened up was intolerable. There, you see? Huh. His father tried not to sound impressed. That's all fine and dandy, but, well, we'll see. The following morning the stain had appeared again, and it was again rubbed out by Washington. I tell you, it must be the ghost, he insisted. There can be no other explanation. That night, Minister Otis personally locked up the library, carried the key with him to his bedchamber. The third morning, however, the stain was back again. At that point, even Minister Otis began to have second thoughts. Maybe the fellow is around after all. I'm sure of it, Pa. I'm going to write Myers and Podmore a letter about this, said Wash, and he went to work with his black stick. How interesting, said Mrs. Otis, looking on. I have toyed with the idea in the past of joining the Psychical Society. Now I think I shall do so. Also looking on, I vowed vengeance for the violence being done our sacred bloodstain. And that night, as Mr. Oscar Wilde put it in one of his finer sentences, all doubts about the objective existence of phantasmata were removed forever. The balance of that day was a busy one for me. There was so much to think about. Everything had to be right. A good deal of my time was spent not in the tapestry chamber but elsewhere. Like most highly cerebral types, I had my favorite secluded spots for various kinds of intense concentration. The tapestry chamber was fine for run-of-the-mill deductive reasoning, but for the heavy stuff, when I had a bit of haunting to do and wished to start my plans running along truly ingenious lines, it was to another region that I repaired. At such times, I loved to go down, down, down into the grim section of the ancient wing, the castle section of Canterville Chase, and slip into a certain dungeon cell that none but I had visited for well over 300 years. Of course, any well-appointed dwelling of the nobility, such as Canterville Chase, was liberally stocked with dungeon cells. I could have made my choice of several. The peculiar charm of this one, however, was that it was occupied. Well, at any rate, it had been. Signs of occupancy were unmistakable. As Oscar put it, Embedded in the wall was a huge iron ring, and chained to it was a gaunt skeleton that was stretched out full length on the stone floor. It seemed to be trying to grasp with its long, fleshless fingers an old-fashioned trencher and ewer that were placed just out of reach. The jug had evidently been filled with water, as it was covered inside with green mold. There was nothing on the trencher but a pile of dust. A melancholy sight, to be sure. Those bones had formerly belonged to one Robin Clump, a Fletcher who lived in the village of Canterville during the time of good Sir Alfred. One day Robin failed to pull his forelock when his lord rode by, or sold him a quiver of arrows with faulty feathers, or committed some other such heinous misdemeanor. The old nobleman was a stickler for manners and a shrewd judge of arrows. At any rate, Sir Alfred, who had what I believe is called a short fuse today, was properly incensed. Getting above himself, is he? A fellow needs to be taught some manners, decided the patriarchal disciplinarian, and he forthwith had Robin fetched off to the castle and down to the dungeon, where under his lordship's energetic direction, Robin was made comfortable in the manner described by Oscar. A couple of weeks in there, and he'll think twice next time before he lets me ride past without so much as a decent grovel, said the beloved lord. Or perhaps next time he won't try to pawn off any half-fledged arrows on me. Tender-hearted man that he was, Sir Alfred only meant to teach the fellow an object lesson and release him as soon as the point had been driven home. But then a man of affairs such as the first Earl had many things on his mind. Boar hunts and masked balls, the hanging of felons and the burning of heretics at the stake, conspiracies against the crown, seduction of the comelier village wenches. People today have no idea how busy manor life was then, and what, with one thing or another, poor Robin Clump completely slipped his mind. It was only when, a year or so later, he had occasion to sentence another member of the Clump family to be whipped and branded for looking at a peasant as though he might be thinking of snaring it, that the saintly nobleman remembered him. "Robin Clump!" he cried, smiting his brow. Then he sighed and shrugged. Well, it's too late now. Thus it was that Robin had lain there, mouldering away for 3 centuries and more, with never a visitor except myself. Yet his involuntary sacrifice had not been in vain, for I found him always to be an inspiration when I was trying to solve some especially knotty problem. On this occasion it was my final choice of costume that was at stake. It took me quite a while to decide. Sitting there on a discarded headman's block, which had once supported a bowl of fresh fruit, cunningly arranged as an additional torment to the starving man. But finally I had it. Chuckling happily, I left young Clump and returned to the tapestry chamber to rummage through my wardrobe. By now the stables had been provided with a good team of bays, 2 grooms, a coachman, and a carriage, and in the cool of the evening the Otis family went for a drive. Returning at 9 o'clock, they had a light supper, spent the evening in conversation, and retired at 11 o'clock. Within a half hour, all the lamps were out. The stage was set. At such a moment as this, it is hard to avoid metaphors of theatrical nature. In the tapestry chamber, where Lady Eleanor was assisting me in the role of wardrobe mistress and dresser, the atmosphere was that of a star's dressing room on opening night. The same electrically charged atmosphere, the same excitement and tension. All that was lacking were flowers and telegrams. "Do I have my eyebrows right?" I asked anxiously, peering into the glass above my dressing table. Lady Eleanor gave my work a critical inspection. "Too level. The right one should be cocked up half an inch more," she said, and I carefully followed her instructions, having found her to be the first-class judge of visual effects, both facial and sartorial. To be sure, she had always had a sense of style, and since she looked well in basic black, her own appearance was quite smart now. This time she had, of course, shed her homely guise as Mrs. Umney, and resumed her own form, so that now she was again the young woman she had been at the time of her final bit of needlework. And my normal appearance, of course, was what it had been on the night I vanished under such mysterious circumstances. Tonight, however, Lady Eleanor's looks seemed subtly enhanced. Ellie, I said, giving her a keen glance in the mirror, you know, you're getting better looking every century. What have you been doing to yourself? She had the conscience to blush, producing a pinkness that became her. Well, as a witch I am allowed a certain latitude, she said. But over and above that, I must confess that since the Otises arrived, I had a woman's natural curiosity about such things. What things? Mrs. Otis's thing. She has a large collection of beauty aids. I had chance to examine them in one jar, while the claims made on the label tempted me to try it. Oh, which one was that? Beaton's Beneficent Beautifying Balm. You mean you've been using it? Yes. Does Mrs. Otis know this? Of course not. Well, really, Eleanor, I am surprised. Pilfering. Look who's talking. Oh, come off it. Just because I may have held a few payments of Spaglierones. A few? All of them. And deprived a rascally Pontvecchian of the pleasure of overcharging me for a silly stiletto. Where is that thing now? In the British Museum, I believe. Is no excuse for your pinching Mrs. Otis's cosmetics, I concluded sternly. By now her cheeks were quite rosy, and I found myself stopping to take another look at her. Still in all, it seems to be doing more for you than it does for her, and she's not bad looking. I turned back to my dressing table, almost embarrassed by my own tribute, but our eyes met in the glass. She had lifted her hand as though to touch me, but drew it away and let it fall to her side. Well, at any rate, it's a help to have you on the premises when there's something as serious as the Otises to be dealt with, I said, making a great show of getting back down to business, with some black eyeshadow. How long do you plan to stay on this time? Until our appointed tasks are accomplished. Not for long, eh? I rejoined, laughing confidently, yet experiencing a curious little twinge of dissatisfaction. It was ridiculous, of course, but I very nearly felt as though this time, once I was again free of her company, I might almost miss her. The fateful hour had come. Terror stalked the corridors of Canterville Chase. Slowly clanking my way along the polished boards, I stopped outside the minister's chamber. The senior Otises slept together in a large canopied bed. Mrs. Otis was inclined to sleep soundly until the birds began to tune up. The minister, however, was a light sleeper. Whilst I waited, I enjoyed picturing how he must even now be sitting bolt upright in bed, his scalp crawling. Unfortunately, he had no hair left to stand on end. His brow bathed in a sudden prickle of cold perspiration. His breath shortening painfully, I gave my chains a couple more good clanks, and then the door opened, and there he was, in a nightshirt and purple dressing gown. Right in front of him, in Oscar's words, the minister saw in the wan moonlight an old man of terrible aspect. His eyes were as red as burning coals, long gray hair fell over his shoulders in matted coils. His garments, which were of antique cut, were soiled and ragged, and from his wrists and ankles hung heavy manacles and rusty gyves. A sight I felt that should have set the family to packing their bags before cockcrow, provided Mr. Otis's shattered condition made it safe to move him by that time. I expected him to utter a strangled cry as he flung a hand before his eyes to blot out the horrid sight, and to be struck down in a heap at my feet. Instead, the man put his hand in his dressing gown pocket, brought out a small brown bottle, and thrust it at me with these words. "My dear sir, I really must insist on you oiling those chains, and have brought you for that purpose a small bottle of the Tammany Rising Sun Lubricator. It is said to be completely efficacious upon one application, and there are several testimonials to that effect on the wrapper from some of our most eminent native divines. I shall leave it here for you by the bedroom candles, and will be happy to supply you with more should you require it." And with this pompous peroration off his chest, the little red rooster of a man set the bottle on the marble-topped table, closed the door in my face, and retired to rest. For an instant I stood there, a speechless spectre. After a 3-century string of unbroken successes, to have a door closed in my face as if I were some panhandling indigent or a door-to-door salesman of inferior dust mops, it was monstrous. But then the humiliation overwhelmed me. I snatched up the bottle, and as Oscar reported, I fled down the corridor, uttering hollow groans and emitting a ghastly green light. Well, who wouldn't after an experience like that? Yet there was worse to come. Just as I reached the top of the great oak staircase, the door of the blue bedchamber was flung open. 2 little gargoyles in nightshirts appeared, and a large pillow whizzed by my head. Well, that did it. Hastily shifting gears, I thinned out and vanished through the wainscoting, thankful I had mastered the art at the academy. Moments later, I was once again in the tapestry chamber, trying to get my breath back, and staring with glazed eyes at the small brown bottle still clutched in my trembling hand. Oscar would have it that in my indignation I dashed the bottle violently upon the floor, but that was untrue. Spread that lubricant all over our beautiful floors? I should hope not. I uncorked it and examined it, and marveled that several eminent native divines had written testimonials to the stuff. Setting it aside on my night table, I sprawled on the bed and gave myself up to the black thoughts. Never in 300 years had I been so grossly insulted. When I thought back over all I had accomplished in that time, this setback seemed unbelievable. That old Dowager Duchess of Bolton, as tough a customer as ever, wore lace and diamonds. Look at the job I had done on her. Now I wished heartily I had never gone near the old harridan. Little had I guessed what a succession of disasters I was setting in motion with that light-hearted escapade. But what about the other highlights in my career? 4 housemaids in hysteric after I merely grinned at them through a curtain? Reverend Augustus Dampier, our parish rector, still under treatment after a midnight encounter? Old Madame de Tremolac, who gave up her acquaintance with Voltaire and went back to the church after I had visited her as a skeleton. The beautiful Lady Stutfield, who was always obliged to wear black velvet band around her throat to hide the mark of 5 fingers burnt upon her white skin, and who drowned herself at the last cart pond at the end of King's Walk. These and a dozen other artistic triumphs passed through my mind, and now to be handed a bottle of Rising Sun lubricator and narrowly missed concussion from a large pillow, had it come to that? No. There would be a next time, and next time I would not fail.